In 1971, the young American architect Mel Sheikh came to Vietnam for the first time under a contract to work with construction contractors here in Vietnam. At that time, he was completely overwhelmed by the great modern-style works built in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s of the 20th century. High-quality construction works built at the time completely made Vietnam modern architect unique and different. He then returned to the US, and in 2005, Mel made a big decision in his life to return to Vietnam and then settle down in this country.
Welcome to the show of Sharing Vietnam on VTC10 at Viz channel. Coming to the show today is Mr. Mel Sheikh, an architectural historian from the USA. Thank you for joining with us.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me here.
So I learned that you had been back to Vietnam to work for 1 year in 1971 to 1972, right?
That's right.
So what made you decide to come back to Vietnam after that?
After that, when I returned in 2005?
Yes.
Well, while I was here in that first year in 1971-72, I was amazed by all the modernist architecture here in the city. It was Saigon, of course, in those days. And I always wanted to come back and figure out, how did this happen? Because you don't see this amount of architecture in the rest of the world. This is a very unique place, so that's why I came back. But I also had a big project as an architect to work on when I came back, so there was work to be done. That really rolls around impressions that I gained when I come back. You know, when I was here before, in the early 70s, you know, I really loved the intensity of life here. You know, you'd walk down the street and there were shops that sold everything. You could find anything here. And these were all small shops. So this is all what in America we call mom and pop stores, right? You know, this is part of the heritage, both of America and here. So when I went back to America, I missed that very much. But I always wanted to come back to see that again. When I came back, I thought, well, things have changed, but they hadn't. That same culture was still here. Very intensive culture, and when I say intensive, it's visually, you know, what I see as I walk down the streets, the beautiful shop houses. Primarily for me, the taste, the food's incredible for me, and the smells. Mostly of food, not always, but whatever it is, that's all part, it all comes together in this intensity of life that you do not see in most other countries, and you definitely do not see in America.
When coming to the phrase modern architecture, most of us will immediately think of like modern buildings and high buildings, which has been sprung up recent years. Right. So can you differentiate the difference of this phrase?
You know, modernism and modernist architecture that resulted from modernism, the philosophical and artistic movement that led to modernist art as well as modernist architecture, really flourished here in the mid-century, 1945 through 1975. Of course, after 1975, there was a decade that not a lot got built here in southern Vietnam, but then as it picked up after Doi Moi, some buildings used the principles of modernist architecture from the mid-century, Vietnamese, very Vietnamese. But they also started to use the more minimalist modernist architecture from the rest of the world, and over time it's all become a little bit more homogenized with global architecture. And so what you're starting to see today, you know, over the last 10 years in particular, is high-rise, bland glass and metal boxes, which are modern, but they're not quite modernist. They're not artistic enough to be modernist.
So most of us think like it is totally modernist, but it's not really modernist. Is a combination of modernist and other style from around the world.
Yeah, they're also really functionalist. They're more
functionalist.
function, and they're cheaper to build, right? So a lot less artistic value here than there was before.
In the book, Southern Vietnamese Modernist Architecture, you have stated that Vietnam is the architectural center of the world. So is there any evidence that make you say that?
First, I call it a center, not the center, because there were other centers of modernist architecture around the world, and still are. You know, when I was first here in 1971, I was amazed by the quantity of modernist architecture here. And I had just graduated from architecture school in America, and there isn't much modernist architecture in America. And I come here and I walk down what is now Win Chai Street, and 100% of the shop houses were beautiful, modernist. You know, it was incredible. And I wanted to figure out, how did this happen? So what I've determined that over the mid-century, the quantity, but the quality of this architecture was just amazing. So it was an unrecognized center. You know, usually when you say it's a center of something, everybody knows it. Nobody outside Vietnam knew it. And in fact, most people within Vietnam didn't realize this too. They consider the architecture ordinary, but it's not. It's very unique in the world.
So what motivated you in 5 years to publish the book?
Yeah, it took about 5 years to publish the book because it took me, I don't speak Vietnamese well enough. It would have helped if I spoke French too, because there's a lot of reference materials I could have looked for. But so I really had to look around the city and find all the good examples. So that takes time, along with photography. To put all that together, it only took 6 months to write the book, and it took another 2 years just to produce the book. So it takes a long time. It's like producing a movie maybe, or a film, right? It takes time beyond just the filming to put it all together. Same thing.
So that's why you published the book?
No, that's why it took so long to publish the book. But I published the book because I wanted people in the world and Vietnam to see how important this architecture is, so that it is a center of modernist architecture in the world, but now it's a known center, right? Especially for Vietnamese. And working with Vietnamese students has been very important to me in helping them to see how important this architecture is.
Songwriter Trinh once wrote, "When you have a country to return from time to time, you are still very much happy." It coincides with Mao Shek's journey back to Vietnam. Having witnessed the grandeur of modern Vietnamese architecture in the past and spending 5 years doing in-depth research on it makes him strong enough to convince people that South Vietnam is the center of modern architecture of the world through the book Vietnamese Modernist Architecture.
Cuốn sách là một nguồn tư liệu quý cho những ai có mong muốn tìm hiểu về kiến trúc Việt Nam bằng một sự tâm huyết và sự nghiêm túc, và kể cả sự hệ thống của Mao Trinh về nền kiến trúc hiện đại tại miền Nam Việt Nam so với bối cảnh phát triển của kiến trúc thế giới. Với tôi thì cuốn sách nó tạo ra một cái ngạc nhiên và niềm cảm hứng lớn, vì trước đây tôi chưa từng nghĩ tại miền Nam lại có nhiều kiến trúc phong phú, kể cả về chất lượng to lớn đến như vậy. Và thực sự là tôi cũng đang đặt mua để tặng cho các thầy cô, bạn bè và các giáo sư ở tại Singapore hay là tại Nhật.
Okay, so I don't know if you had seen the movies which is named Social Dilemma.
Not that I recall,
Yeah.
but I get the idea.
So you got the idea. And In my point of view, I think that if we know how to use the social media in a controlled way, then you can take more advantages than just disadvantages. And the advantages will outweigh the disadvantages, right? So I think the page that you set up on Facebook is an example. So can you talk a little bit more about it?
Sure. The Vietnamese Modernist Architecture Group on Facebook, we now have 6,400 members, which is pretty good over a 5-year period. But it's a very public group. Nevertheless, it's a very controlled group. The minute some advertisement shows up, we delete it right away. So it's a very serious group where people can study and see. And the best thing with the growth of the membership, it's all Vietnamese pretty much now, is that they are contributing amazing examples of the mid-century modernist architecture in this group. So this group is having a lot of educational value now to people.
So I think about our educational values, you can make people understand more about our modernist architecture, right?
Sure, and the whole idea is to raise awareness of it because it won't be saved unless people are aware of its value.
So if you now have to convince someone to believe in the values of their historical heritage that brings to our lives, so which points would you make?
Well, I would start by saying that Vietnamese modernist architecture resulted from the young Vietnamese architects coming out of l'École des Beaux-Arts de l'Indochine in Hanoi, as well as École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Those young Vietnamese architects over the first half of the 20th century studied Vietnamese traditional architecture very closely. So they understood why the Vietnamese traditional architecture expressed Vietnamese identity. And then, of course, over the period of colonization, we lost a lot of that. So these young architects, after colonization, realized that this was an opportunity now to regain Vietnamese identity. And that's exactly what they did. Although they didn't copy the Vietnamese traditional architecture, their architecture, the modernist architecture, reflects that same Vietnamese identity. So that's what's important here. When you don't save your heritage, this heritage expresses identity. So if you let it go, then you lose some of your heritage. So that's the prime value is identity. The second is the southern, well, all of Vietnam, really, but especially here in Ho Chi Minh City. You know, we have a lot of diversity of architecture here that a lot of other cities don't have. And it's very beautiful architecture, some traditional Vietnamese, a lot of colonial, and the mid-century Vietnamese modernist architecture, as well as the new high-rise buildings. They all work together to make a very interesting place. And that has economic value. That's tourism, right? You know, the tourists that want to come here, this is what they want to see, this identity, both the identity of Vietnam as well as the past, the colonial past. They also want to see where it's going into the future. So all of these things work together here to provide great economic value. So when you throw some of it away, whether it's colonial buildings or whether it's the newer mid-century modernist buildings, you're throwing away what provides this great diversity and interest in architecture. So that's really what the city government and the developers ought to be looking at, is the economic value, what you can do with these properties to really make them serve tourism as well as the people of the city.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today, and thank you for your sharing about the useful knowledge and information with us. And I wish you health and success.
All right, thank you very much. I was very happy to be here and talk with you.
The time for the show is up. Thank you for watching and see you next time on Sharing Vietnam.